So we have no exact allocation of places, therefore we need to say. So my name is Taras Kachka, and I've been negotiating association agreement, and that's why I like the idea of integration without membership, because as an idea of association agreement is political association, economic integration, and but finally association agreement has entered into force. This is a real success, I think, rather geopolitical success, because we really saw an oppression from Russian Federation to block by every possible mean the association agreement, and it's entered into force. Finally, it's entered into force. And now, after a year of, let's say, full applicability and full function of association agreement, now we have a discussion about different models of integration with the EU for states who are not members of the EU. And we still have plenty of models, and all our speakers will talk about different models and different ideas. And historical one, new one, all rather, let's say, matured on new ideas or future ideas. And the problems, you will see that all these ideas are applicable to other states than Ukraine. And the question is why we have discussion about other models of integration and not the model of Ukrainian integration. And the answer to this question is that there is no clear understanding on how the association agreement will actually provide for economic integration of Ukraine to the EU, and Georgia and Moldova as well. So we all three states are working on implementation of association agreement, but the question how this model will work in future is still open, and unfortunately there is no clear vision from all sides of participants. So both associated states and European institutions on how this model will work. We based our negotiating position almost 10 years ago on the idea of European Economic Area. Because European Economic Area is the, let's say, oldest model of integrating of non-EU states with the European Union. And that's why I will invite Michael Emerson to explore a little bit more about how the European Economic Area concept is applicable to, let's say, association agreements of Georgia, Moldova, and Ukraine, whether it makes sense to use European Economic Area as an experience or as a let's say, explanatory tool, explanatory model for our current relations with the EU or not. What are the pros and cons?
Thank you very much, Kaka. Well, I'm delighted to try to respond to very precisely the questions you've been raising here. My starting point on all this is to say that I perceive, understand, feel the sentiment in all three of the associated countries, a need for something next, some renewed momentum mechanism. They all know they've got a hell of a lot of work to do, but still there seems to be a political demand for a something. And so I'm going to explore what that might be. Part of the background of my views on this are founded on the paper that I placed outside in numerous copies that some of you may have picked up about, which is on Balkan and the trio East European comparisons, the pertinence of which at the top level is that, hey, you've got all these Balkan countries that have membership perspective, whereas the trio do not. So how do these two sets compare? Well, this is a nice research topic, which we went through in considerable detail. And there's a methodological innovation that we adopted in this paper, which is really how actually, with quantified variables, to compare the Balkans with the three associated states. And actually we found this a practicable proposition because building on what the European Commission publishes for the Balkan states and what we've been publishing in our project with the handbooks on the three states. Basically, if you look at what the Commission is doing for the Balkan states, for all of the chapters of their association SAAs, which are the same chapters as for the DCFTAs, the Commission does detailed analysis, but they come to a bottom line assessment. Are these countries, without numbers, they say, are these countries well prepared for EU accession? Are they moderately well prepared? Are they a little prepared? Or are they zero prepared? And this allows us to say, well, this is fine. They've got a ranking there, which is 0, 1, 2, 3. So let us use that as a reference. Then we found that going through handbook materials, and in particular the second editions of the handbook, which is about to be published, we found it possible to make comparable assessments. And so in this paper, you see at the end of it, a detailed chapter by chapter assessing all of the Balkans and the three in terms of 0, 1, 2, 3 by chapters, and then it can be aggregated. There are five, we decided to give a weight, equal weight to the political and the economic, which meant taking the average of 5 political chapters and no less than 20 economic chapters of the DCFTA. And so turn the handle, the calculating machine, and out comes the results. And the results are that, broadly speaking, within these two groups, Balkans and the associated countries, their leaders and laggards. But in both cases, they're comparable. And in particular, in the case of the leaders, the front runners, Georgia is comparable to Serbia and Montenegro, who are the official front runners in the Balkans, but in fact doing a bit better. And as regards the others, the laggards, they're also relatively comparable. So this feeds back into the question as to what to do in this situation when these two groups, who are politically distinguished by the European Union in terms of membership perspective or not, that are not only highly comparable, but actually they're doing practically the same thing. So that leads into the question as to what should be done. So I got a list of options, and I go through very rapidly. Number one is actually just get on with it. This is a premature question. You've got a lot of work to do, and don't ask premature questions. Well, some people in Brussels, let us say, are approximately in that mindset, but not all of them. I think that is an inadequate view because fundamentally the association process is not on a one-track possibility. There is Russia up there that has taken half or several of the Eastern Partnership countries into the Eurasian Economic Union, and we all know about Russia's so-called diplomacy in the Eastern Partnership and in the European Union itself. And so if the European Union maintains a position of perceived strategic ambiguity as to whether the EU really wants these countries or not, this is absolutely good news for the propaganda merchants dependent upon the Kremlin to say, they don't really want you, but we do want you, you can come and join our Eurasian Union. So this is a reason why I think this first option, namely just get on with it, is not politically adequate. So the second option then is, okay, rethink about the membership perspective question. The EU is being inconsistent. It's quite clear that Georgia is well-placed, objectively, with all of this detailed analysis for membership perspective. Well, the problem here is that this proposition, very reasonable as it is, runs into a real brick wall of opposition by a sufficient number of EU member states. So we have to think for the time being about other initiatives of conceivable strategic interest. Well, next candidate is, which is known by President Poroshenko, is to accede to the customs union. Okay, there it is. We know what it is. The mechanism exists, and it sounds important. Unfortunately, there are serious disadvantages attached to this proposition. First one is you'd have to scrap your free trade agreements with other CIS countries like Kazakhstan or Belarus, and even more important, it is to understand that if you join the customs union, you have to extend to the EU's free trade partners all the preferences that the EU gives, but on the other side, there's no guarantee that you will get the tariff preferences that the EU enjoys vis-a-vis these countries. You'd have to negotiate it, and as Turkey has learnt painfully in the Mexico case, it doesn't always work. Mexico said no, sorry.
Ukraine as well.
What?
Ukraine as well.
Doesn't work, yeah.
We refused.
So anyway, this is the reason why I think the customs union idea for Ukraine is not a suitable idea, and it's even worse idea for Georgia because it means scrapping their free trade agreement with Asian countries, China included. Okay, so we've got to move on and find out some better ideas. Now, there's a very interesting paper by Yuri Vdovenko. Is he here in the room? Huh? Tomorrow, okay. Well, it's a nice paper. He has two ideas in there which have to be considered. One is that the trio could join CEFTA, and another one is that the three together should form what he calls a neighborhood economic community. So this is intra-tree integration. Well, I thought about this, but I think both are kind of nice ideas. But if you have in mind that the three DCFTA cases are all extending their matrix of free trade agreements basically with the rest of Europe, including the Balkan states, and that they are all joining in the pan-European MED system for rules of origin and preferences, which they're doing. It isn't finished yet, but it's underway. Given all of that, it's not clear to me that either the CEFTA or this new neighborhood economic community concept has really very much to offer beyond a sentiment. So I don't find that adequate. Now, the next candidate, which you already mentioned, Kaja, is to aim at accession to the European Economic Area, the EEA. And I find this now, having tried to find some good avenue, a significant one, politically significant, economically significant avenue, I find this the best candidate, starting with the idea that, well, you know that there's, Georgia's doing these things better at the moment than yet Ukraine and Moldova. And so for the latter two, the idea of accession to the European Economic Area is really lacking in credibility for the time being. But for Georgia, it is conceivable that they could make a bid for this. Now, if they did make this proposal in some time, then it actually has quite interesting features. First of all, it totally avoids the customs union problem. You're free to do this, and you can go on and carry on making all the other free trade agreements you want to in the rest of the world. And secondly, it avoids the membership perspective roadblock. Yet, if one was to do it, you think it through, and suppose that the EEA would agree to it in due course, then the country in question would have made a major step towards full accession without having knocked its head against the membership perspective brick wall. Now, okay, that might be quite nice for idea for Georgia. Well, what about the other two? Well, I would say for them too, it could be quite an interesting proposition if one has the sequencing idea. They might see Georgia going ahead with this, and they might be getting the message that if they got their act together better, they could follow in that track also. So I think it's a matter of common interest. My final point that follows from the content of this paper I've distributed is to is really the European Union itself needs to rethink its neighbourhood policy, which is outstandingly obsolete given the huge divergences that have emerged both between East and South and within the East and within the South, and not to forget the other neighbour, big neighbour, Turkey, and the next big new neighbour called the United Kingdom if the Brexit business goes through. Now, why put all of them together? Well, they don't really want to join a new confederation together, absolutely not. But the point is that the mechanisms of the European Union is deploying into its neighbourhood is a huge common set. I mean, deep free trade areas of one kind or another, preferential rules of origin, civil aviation, transport corridors, Horizon 2020, Erasmus, EIB, EBRD, all of these instruments are basically available in different packages to all of the neighbours. And it seems to me that the concept of the neighbourhood policy is something concerning 6 eastern countries, and is it 8 Mediterranean ones, including Syria. This geographic map is no use anymore, and it's best to have a neighbourhood concept that concentrates on the instruments, practical instruments that the EU is deploying in its neighbourhood, and leave the question of the map relatively open and somewhat flexible. Thank you.
Thank you, Michael. Indeed, I fully agree with you that the key problem is that for the moment there is lack of intellectual and, let's say, flexible thinking on the EU side about particular states, because it's difficult to talk about the group of states which includes Belarus, Ukraine, Georgia, and then Syria and Moldova as well. So that we have different strategies. But the problem is that also somehow the EU managed to forget its own history and ideas how to cooperate with other European states. And talking about history, we have a very specific example in Europe, which is quite close to Ukrainian story. It's Austria, because Austria was out of the EU due to strong commitment on neutrality towards Soviet Union. And as well as Ukraine now somehow still perceived by some politicians in the Europe as a potential gray area and area of influence of Russia, and some geopolitical thinking behind Ukrainian membership perspective still exists. And at the same time, Austria was one of key leaders of creation of this European Economic Area, but which resulted in membership of Austria in the EU. That's why sometimes you can say that purely Austrian experience could be as the best example of how to build relations of Georgia, Moldova, and Ukraine with the EU, taking into consideration both geopolitical and legal things. And this time Austria as well is quite active in thinking about Balkan policy, and that's why I think that Christoph Bender experience as Deputy Chairman of European Stability Initiative will be quite useful for associate countries of Eastern Partnership. basic, taking into account Austrian experience and Austrian initiatives on Balkans as well. So please, floor is yours.
Thank you, Taras, and good morning, everyone. I'm Austrian, that's true. I remember when we joined in 1995, but that's not an issue I have actually been really kind of thinking all too much about in recent years. I have other worries in Austria at the moment. So let me focus on the Balkan story, which I think might also today kind of offer more relevant experiences. And when we look at the Balkans and their kind of experiences in this pre-accession and accession process, it's a very mixed story with some successes, with a lot of mistakes, with a lot of setbacks. But that's not what I want to talk about. I want to talk about something which I think might be relevant here in the context of this debate today and tomorrow. I think when we look at the Western Balkans experience, there is one model which worked really well, where the European Union had a useful, measurable influence on countries which were not part of the accession process yet. And this is the process which led to visa liberalization. You're all familiar with it. It's essentially a very simple principle, simple idea. First, spell out concretely in understandable language the criteria which have to be met, put them on a list, ideally the same list for all the countries which are participating, then assess with knowledgeable experts, strictly and fairly. The European Union at the time, had also the skeptical member states who could second their experts into these groups, which I think was important, in order to track progress, and then also to publicly report about the findings of these groups, so making kind of the assessments public. This worked really well. It produced two major effects. One, it encouraged reforms, really. This becomes, I think, very obvious when we look at Bosnia and Herzegovina, where initially the political elite thought, this is a political issue. There's no way that sort of they will give visa-free travel to Serbia, the aggressor of the wars, and kind of would leave us, the victims, out of this. But then when the first assessment came in, there was this realization, but we are really doing badly. And so this is really about meeting this criteria. And then what happened is quite interesting, because Bosnia is often seen as this very complicated country, difficult country. You had a real mobilization in civil society, but also in the political elite, in the administration, to really push through these reforms. And that was actually very successful. So when Bosnia then got visa-free travel a year after sort of the front runners, according to the Commission's assessments, they were even better prepared than Serbia and Montenegro a year earlier. Now, this was successful, but we left it somewhere at this. Right? And I think there is no reason why this could not be replicated in other areas. Corruption, big issue, big topic in all of these countries here. Let's take the public procurement chapter and break down kind of into lists of criteria and maybe sub-lists, like roadmaps, what needs to be done in this area. Fields related to the common market, food security, statistics, consumer protection, you name it. I mean, ideally kind of, taking the more the better kind of parts of the acquis and breaking them down into concrete lists of criteria, what needs to be done, then to assess them in a serious manner, which I think currently the Commission is not really doing neither here nor in the Balkans, and make this public in an understandable and serious language. I think this would have three major benefits. One is it would sort of break down abstract ideas about reform, like fighting corruption. It's very generic. Kind of breaking this down into very concrete reform goals. Second, I think it would create a different reform dynamic in the countries by basically having serious assessments and having them up in the public in an understandable language. it would strengthen reformers. It would allow political leaders and people in the administration to actually claim when they achieve something. But on the other hand, it also allows opposition, critical media, civil society organizations to actually also have a closer look at what the governments and the administrations are actually delivering in all these areas, ideally being able to compare this to other countries, which then also can be used in order to exert more pressure for reforms to move forward. And the third point, or the third big benefit, I think, would be that it would avoid, to a large extent, this, how should I say, this largely ideological debate. If a country is a potential candidate, is it a candidate? Does it, is it negotiating or is it not yet negotiating? Has it opened Chapter 6 or hasn't it opened Chapter 6? Which actually takes a lot of energy and has kind of, is a real problem in the Western Balkans. We all debate about this, the formal status in negotiations, but not on the substance. So this would allow actually to focus on substance, which I think would be in the interest of everyone. Now, ideally, it would be the European Commission who would do that. I'm not really sure if they can be convinced. But I think even if the European Commission would not actually go along with something like this, one could address individual member states. And I think there are some who really could be interested in funding and in supporting something like this. Like it was raised yesterday, maybe if there is an initiative from all three countries together, approaching some of them and saying, it could also be, I don't know, for the start with 2 or 3 areas only, say, we are aware of our challenges, we have significant problems, we would really like to address this, but we need help. We think this is a good way to go. Then I think actually, I know the Swedes or the Dutch would actually maybe be actually interested in helping. Now, maybe the last thing, why would Ukraine and Georgia and Moldova actually want to do this? You might say, with visa liberalization, there was a sort of a clear reward at the end. There was visa liberalization, visa-free travel to the Schengen area, which benefited the whole society. But with I know statistics or public procurement, what's the benefit? What's the reward? But I think there is a reward. A meaningful process that helps with reforms, I think, is actually a big reward as such, and it would also show in a credible way when reforms actually have been really achieved, which I think, given the the sentiment of enlargement in the European Union, will become ever more important. I think the bar is high, but it's also crucial to be able to show that progress has been made, if progress has been made. It's a bit like kind of, I don't know, Stanford Business School, And if you work very hard to get into it, you pay a lot of money, in order to work even harder, right? And in the end, you get a sheet of paper. So it's a bit of a certificate of achievements, which I think would be very helpful in this process for all interested in reforms in Ukraine, Georgia, and Moldova. Thank you.
Thank you, Christoph. I think that just as an immediate answer to your idea, I think that this is exactly the mechanics which is proposed and pursued by Ukraine in dialogue with the EU. So that's what we are saying, is that we really want to use this visa liberalization action plan experience in other areas in terms of mechanics. So not in terms of form, because we have a discussion in terms of form, how to do it, what will be this certificate, so that, because we believe it, we call it full internal market treatment, and the Commission is carried by these words, despite the fact that they are embedded in the agreement. So we are talking about this, the same mechanics in energy, in digital markets, in customs, and in industrial cooperation, so by means of agreement on conformity assessment and acceptance, and also further step in free movement of people, so something which is around this Schengen acquis without using Schengen, because word Schengen is scaring the European Commission even more than full internal market treatment. So that's why this all reminds scary movie for all this our dialogue. But I would like also to underline that what you're talking is more how to use, and you absolutely correctly mentioned this is a sentiment of enlargement, which can be used for boosting processes inside associated states, and also can boost the, let's say, also Commission thinking or the European institution thinking. But what is important is that due to certain events, we also have a situation when the old concept of integration without membership revived in pan-European discussion. And this is Brexit, actually, because Brexit brings on the agenda the idea how UK will trade and how UK will coexist with the EU after exiting the European Union. And for me, it was a real surprise how TF50, so the task force of Michel Barnier, analyzed all the concept from legal perspective. So EEA, Swiss model, Turkish model, and even Ukrainian model. And for me, it was a surprise then that the group inside the Commission, which works in the geographically northwestern region of Europe, knows better about relations with East and South, means Ukraine and Moldova, than support group for Ukraine, which actually is dedicated to help Ukraine to integrate to the EU. But it was for me a surprise that support group for Ukraine has no such thinking at all, like Barnier thinks about different models of integration. And finally, the internal discussion in the UK also resulted in this checkers idea, which is now as a positive concept in comparison to total no deal idea. And this checkers package really looks like association agreement, which is concluded by Ukraine and Georgia and Moldova, of course with more intensive integration. So I would like to comment on this Adam Blazowski, who is working on this, also works in the UK as a professor of law. So how do you think this idea of these non-EU relations built on experience of association agreement will work? If eventually it will work, because it depends on political dialogue, but in terms of mechanics, how UK is using this experience of associated state for developing its own attitude towards the EU?
Thank you. Does it work now? No. That's okay, brilliant. Good morning, everyone. Dobroho ranku. Since Taras mentioned that I work in the UK and I come from the UK, I think it's in order to start with an apology for what we've done, although it's not my fault. Now, I've prepared things about Balkans and EEA, but we can use it in the discussion. Now, since Brexit, I've been called to speak about Brexit. There's a number of points. First of all, the checkers proposal, which the Prime Minister put on the table, apparently took the phones away from her cabinet so that they would not call the press, locked them in the checkers and forced them to agree. Well, eventually the couple resigned the following day. And checkers agreement, as far as I'm concerned, is toast. It's not going to work, neither in the United Kingdom nor in the European Union. Michel Barnier, Donald Tusk made it absolutely clear yesterday that checkers needs to be reworked. And the Conservative Party also makes it clear, especially the Brexit hardcore backbenchers, they make it clear to the Prime Minister that that's not going to work. The problem I would see at this stage is that it's almost October, and the United Kingdom is due to leave on the 29th of March next year. As far as I'm concerned, basic risk assessment principles dictate that this exercise should have been done before the referendum. Not now. We are seriously at risk of having an accidental no-deal Brexit on the 29th of March. Now, when it comes to models that were discussed before the referendum, during the campaign, and after the referendum, and the past 2 years, well, obviously, the starting point were these so-called off-the-shelf models. And the first one was the European Economic Area. Many conservatives were saying, oh, that's actually the Norwegian model that is ideal for us. Now, those who actually knew what they were talking about immediately said, well, hang on a minute, be careful what you wish for. Because you wanted to gain back sovereignty, take back control, well, you would join an outlet where you have to comply with, depending on the assessment, 60–70% of EU law without participation in the decision making. That's not exactly taking back control. That's actually becoming a norm taker from being a norm maker. And therefore, the European Economic Area was very quickly dropped. Now it's popping up again as in a stage of panic among some of the conservatives. But they keep on forgetting one thing, that to join the EEA from being a member state of the European Union, it's not so easy. In technical terms, you need to withdraw from the EU, withdraw from the EEA as an EU country, then join EFTA, and then join EEA again as the EFTA country. There's simply no time left for this. And even if we were thinking about it seriously on the day of the referendum, 2 years or 2.5 years, that's simply not enough for such a complex exercise, not to mention the politics of it, that you need to ask kindly, for instance, Norway, do you mind if we join EEA as an antechamber to something in the future? Because that's how the United Kingdom perceived the European Economic Area, not as a permanent solution, but as an antechamber to some sort of super-duper trade deal later. Then, of course, is the Swiss model, which is box of chocolates integration. Switzerland and EU have 120, circa 120 bilateral agreements, which are not only very difficult to navigate, but also there is no coherent institutional framework. And EU is having this ping-pong now with Switzerland, trying to persuade the Swiss authorities to sign a separate deal on the institutional framework, because it simply doesn't work when you have so many agreements. So the moment UK raised this point, we want to be like Switzerland, perhaps, the European Union immediately said, no, forget it. We have this one experiment with Switzerland, that's more than enough, thank you very much. That's tempting, but no. Then the association agreement with Ukraine as a model. This was initially laughed at, to be honest, in the public debate, and then the Conservatives started, and Labour started to take it more seriously. Now, I see a major problem here. That is the fact that you have lists of EU acquis that you have to comply with, and the presumption is that the model is dynamic. And therefore, whether you like it or not, you are persuaded to accept EU acquis as it develops. So going back to the main argument of the Leave camp, taking back control, that's not exactly taking back control by any stretch of imagination. So, where are we now? Well, one option obviously is the no-deal scenario, and I think it's quite realistic, unfortunately. The other option is we kick the can down the road, which means we have the withdrawal agreement signed and entered into force on 29th of March, with some very basic declaration annexed to it, explaining what the future relations might look like. And then the elephant in the room will be the status of the border between Northern Ireland and Ireland, because that's the main stumbling block in the negotiations. But watch out, Spain again has raised Gibraltar a couple of days ago, so this is coming back to the table as well. Now, withdrawal agreement under those conditions enters into force. It's exclusive competence, so it's EU, UK. We assume that the European Parliament approves it. So for the European Parliament, all the sections about citizens' rights are bulletproof. And we also assume, which I would not take for granted at all, that the Parliament in London actually approves it. Because the Parliament simply voted down. And then we accidentally leave the EU on the 29th of March, unless there is a common agreement. We extend the 2-year period from Article 50, and then God knows for how many years. Now, if the withdrawal agreement enters into force, then we start the transition. UK formally leaves the European Union, does not participate in the decision-making, it's bound by EU law in its entirety, and subject to jurisdiction of the Court of Justice and the European Commission. This is taking back control. I should emphasize that. And this goes on for a year and a half. And of course, the UK pays to the EU budget, as it's supposed to pay. But it's outside of the European Union. Now, the withdrawal agreement as it stands today does not provide a clause for extension. So the transition period ends in 2020, that's it. There's no way to go back to Article 50 and extend the negotiations because we are already outside of the European Union. So we have a year and a half, more or less, to come up with something. So far, we've had very vague words coming from both sides. We want to have strategic partnership, deep and comprehensive trade cooperation, security cooperation. But of course, those are empty words. The question is what is behind it, what is there on the table, and honestly, what can be agreed by both sides. And what we see in the United Kingdom is that the UK, the current government, is largely not negotiating with the EU, but with itself. They're spending more time negotiating within the Conservative Party what they want in relations with Europe than actually negotiating with Barnier and his team, who are sitting and waiting until London comes up with something credible and sensible. So my honest answer when it comes to Brexit is, I don't know. I honestly don't know. We'll see what's going to happen in the next few months. We had, of course, the informal European Council yesterday, where the Prime Minister was allowed to present her short speech after dinner. I'm not sure if that impressed the heads of state and governments of the remaining 27 member states, but the pressure is mounting. I honestly hope that common sense will prevail, and the withdrawal agreement will provide for some kind of organized Brexit, and then there will be a solution to Northern Ireland. Although for any customs lawyer, it's almost impossible to square the circle, and politically in the UK, it's going to be very, very fast. Very difficult. I'm sorry, not fast, but difficult. Now, if I may steal 2 more minutes about a few points that were made by the previous speakers and also that were made yesterday. Now, the European perspective, this was mentioned during the first panel yesterday, and the fact that all three association agreements have those very general clauses about European perspective in the preamble. Now, frankly, politically it is important, I understand that, but from the legal point of view, this is not prerequisite for membership. If we look at Europe agreements with Central and Eastern Europe, they either had unilateral declarations or nothing. We still have Article 49 of the EU Treaty, which very clearly says any European country can apply for membership. There's nothing stopping, formally speaking, Georgia, Ukraine or Moldova from applying for membership. That's perfectly clear, legally speaking. The politics of it is a different kettle of fish. Now, when it comes to Western Balkans, what we see now is that those countries have the European perspective. They've had this perspective for more than 10 years or more, and only one country joined. 2 are negotiating, and we know that it's quite tricky. And for the remaining countries, the EU is slowly, to keep the momentum, separating screening exercise from actual negotiations, to keep those countries with their hopes, in EU's proximity, not to go towards Russia or elsewhere. So this is slowly evolving, but we need to bear in mind, and this was also said, that the European Union is not really willing to let the new countries in the nearest future. It has a number of problems on the agenda, which are, existential threats. Of course, it's the Eurozone crisis. It's been a bit quiet, but this may come up again. It's the immigration/Schengen problem, not to mention the growing problem of constitutional vandalism in several member states, including one of the biggest member states of the European Union. So yes, there is the membership perspective. It doesn't have to be written down in the association agreement. It's enough to look at the EU treaty. Partial membership are already covered. So what I would suggest, and I think that would be my final point, that short term, the priority should be full implementation of the association agreements by all three countries to have bulletproof arguments in negotiations with the European Union. Otherwise, what we may face is a situation where the EU says, well, if you cannot do less, you won't be able to do more. So any discussion, I would say, about partial membership, etc., is more of a mid or even long-term perspective. There's enough work that needs to be done with the association agreements, not to mention energy community, transport agreements, and potentially transport community. Thank you.
Thank you, Adam. Indeed, the discussion about Brexit is sometimes more political than technical one, but at the same time, what I see is that even draft of this withdrawal agreement is, let's say, more detailed and well elaborated than some elements of association agreement. And it's also it presents the level of attention of European institution towards different states. So it is clear UK is member state of the EU and is fully integrated, almost fully integrated, yeah, with all these caveats and exemptions applied by the UK. That's why sometimes we see the Brexit not as a problem, but as a chance to explain what we are talking about when we are talking about, for example, industrial integration and using this technical regulation not as a boring tool of dialogue between people who are dealing with this issue, but as a tool for industrial economic integration of Ukraine with the EU, and some other different parts like customs features, all this how to use customs cooperation and integration of customs as a tool for full open borders, and this tool is more efficient than customs union, as Michael mentioned. So, but what I think and what is important is in Brexit is that for me personally is that political discussion about big topics is so easily overshadowed technical discussion that sometimes it's difficult to talk rationally, because honestly, we can use Brexit as a model for explaining what we want. But once you mention word Brexit, it means you see we are just members, the states are leaving the EU, and you are talking about integration, why, and so on. So from rhetoric point of view, mentioning Brexit is like killing any discussion about economic integration. At the same time, from rational expert point of view, this is the best tool for explaining what can be achieved by Georgia, Moldova, and Ukraine. And it reminds me a quite interesting thing about European Economic Area. So European Economic Area as a technical tool, and we all see these agreements, how they work, operate, decisions of joint committee, and so on. But this agreement is a result of long political dialogue between EFTA and then European Economic Community, and then European Community, led by Jacques Delors, so that all the big things in Europe are invented by French people. Yeah, so Jacques Delors is, for me now, is my champion, not only due to internal market, but also due to the fact that he led this Luxembourg process, and his speech in January 1989 about the vision of integration of non-EU, non-EC at the time, non-EC members to the internal market of European communities is really a sign of political vision of what to do, and it is an example of lack of this vision currently at conscious of any European politician. At the same time, what we see now is that France once again is trying to lead the political debate about future of Europe, and we have good examples of speeches of President Macron in Sorbonne and in European Parliament, and vision of future development of the European Union is, for me, I really like what Emmanuel Macron is presented, but at the same time, when he speaks about non-EU states, European states. He mentioned UK as an individual deal. He mentions Western Balkans, and he never mentioned either Moldova, Georgia, or Ukraine, or region as such. So that's why I think that the question is whether the general topic about relations of non-EU European state can be on agenda of discussion about future of Europe, and what is the how to include this topic of, let's say, integration of non-EU states into the broader political debate about future of Europe as led by Emmanuel Macron. And I think that I will ask this question to Nicolas Denzer. I tried to read carefully in English the title of your institution. This is a Center of Studies and Reflection on Political Actions. So what do you think, whether it is possible at all?
Thank you, Taras. But I think that you were just mentioning Jacques Delors, and I agree with you that probably it was the last, I will say, visionary president of the EU Commission, and that we have absolutely no one after him. But having said that, I have to mention that Jacques Delors' view was very, very consistent, very broad, very sound, but it lacks something, which is the geopolitical dimension. I would say the same for Pascal Lamy, and Pascal Lamy was his head of staff, then European commissioners, and of course the Director General of the WTO. And I have a chance to discuss quite often to Pascal, who is a good friend, but we completely disagree on one thing, which is that Europe is all about geopolitics, and especially right now, with Russia's threat, Russia trying to dismantle, to unravel the EU as such, and also to block any other membership. And I think that with the help of many EU states, for now, Russia was quite successful. And the real problem for me is how to belie this prophecy of Russia becoming, in fact, the big power succeeding in dismantling Europe. And from this point of view, when it comes to the Eastern Partnership and the Association Agreement, the first thing I will say is that, of course, you have to be successful on the implementation of the European Association Agreement, not for the EU, not for the EU member states, for yourselves. Because for yourself, if we understand what the acquis is all about, is about, democracy, human rights, transparency. It's basically about having successful democracies in those countries, and having successful democracy is what Russia is the more afraid of, which is, I think, an important point. If you are successful, I think it will really give back confidence to the EU member states. And as you know, myself, in France, I am one of the voices advocating, some real move forwards with Ukraine, also with Georgia and Moldova, but of course, since a very long time, because I'm covering, all what happened in Ukraine since the beginning and visited Ukraine more than 15 times. I think that there is a true challenge, which is a true challenge, is to really demonstrate that the trust is back. And I think that from this point of view, we have, of course, to take into account the new mood in Europe and the context that we are witnessing right now. And the context, as you know, is the following one, which is the fact that, let's speak bluntly, if we had some countries named Romania, Bulgaria, Hungary, knocking on the door of Europe, we would say no. And probably we would be right to do so, unfortunately. Poland is another story. Poland, it's just in between. Because, and that's some things, I am quite often saying to my Polish friends, I'm going very often to Poland, and I will be in 3 weeks from now also, is that first of all you are, of course, a trustful and trustable member of NATO. You are advocating, you know, very clearly the values of the Western Alliance. You know who your enemy is, which is our common enemy. No doubt about that. And I'm saying enemy, not adversary, because it's an enemy. But on the other side, you are just giving arguments, tools to Russia, to Kremlin, because ideologically you are on the same line with the Kremlin. That's the problem of Poland right now. You are destroying the geopolitical stance and geopolitical positions that we are trying to advance in Europe. And that, I think, is what's to make the complexity, you know, of Poland right now. Because, of course, Poland is a member state. But I do not remember myself, because my grandparents have had to flee Poland. They were Polish Jews. And that's, of course, the real responsibility for the disaster. It was at the beginning of the 19th. They were not probably not only, it was not Russia, not Nazis, but Poles themselves. So we have really, in the very special moment right now, to understand what all Europe is about. And I think that's also very important for all those three countries, members of the Eastern Partnership, Ukraine, Moldova, and Georgia, really to demonstrate that they are standing for the same values. Now, having said that, I think I want just to elaborate very quickly on the key dimensions, in my view, on the association agreements. First of all, you have, of course, all the technical elements. Technical elements is about, you know, the norms, about the different roles regarding safety, regarding environment, regarding transport, regarding, you know, the accountability, regarding a lot of things. Of course, you have to be successful, because I think you have really to demonstrate that you are able to completely comply with the acquis and with the rules of the acquis. That's basically that you have to demonstrate, not because you are committed to, because it's not a real commitment, but because you are willing to. And you have, of course, to demonstrate to the public opinion, both, you know, in Ukraine, Moldova, and Georgia, and to the public opinion in the EU member states, that you are able to do so, and that you have absolutely no hesitation. The second thing is about the rule of law. And rule of law is nowadays crucial, because of what I mentioned very quickly about Hungary, about Bulgaria. You know, you have a lot of corruption, you have crimes, and you know, the scores of the Bulgarians regarding the media freedom, I think the last one in Europe, etc., etc. But also for Hungary, you know, not mentioning, you know, what you perfectly know. And I think that, of course, the European Parliament was completely right to vote for the Article 7 of the EU Treaty recently. Rule of law is absolutely fundamental, because it means that when it comes to the independence of the judiciary, the fight against corruptions, the free media, and the capacity, of course, for the citizen to control the government, to give a big room to the civil society, really there is absolutely no hesitation. And just to say it very clearly, there are some progresses to be made, certainly. But that's a true commitment. And I think that we have to perceive that Europe and the European member states are more demanding right now than they were before, certainly. Maybe it could seem to be a bit unfair, but that's the truth. So you have to be completely exemplary. And I think that's very important. But of course you have to sell it also to your own citizens. When there is, of course, there is the third dimension, which is the political dimension. And the political dimension is, of course, about, you know, the openness, the exemplarity of the political class, which is about, you know, the way the parliament is functioning and the image of the parliament. your own, I will say, domestic parliament, which is very important in all those countries. The fourth dimension is trade, obviously. Already talking about trade. And trade is, I think, very important. And trade is an issue, of course, that of course is about the future, because at the future of the economy is at the future of the relationship with the EU. Of course, there are different kind of shapes. But I think it's also important that when it comes to the trade, you demonstrate that you are aware also of the rising influence of not, I will say, competitive states, not about, competing states, but not about, other areas of the world, but of the states that are not sharing the same standards than the standards of the EU Union. And when you have some economies, but of course it could be also for some EU member states, not only for the 3 countries, being in a way more open or willing to accept Chinese investments, Turkish investments, not even in some cases mentioning Russian investments, then of course I would say European investments. That could be a true story. So the main issue is who do you envision the future of your own trades? And I saw also in the Western Balkans, and you know that when you see the amount of Chinese and Turkish investments, I think it's really something very worrying, because behind that you have also influence. Behind that you have also standards which are not the standards of the EU. And the 5th dimension, I think, of course, is, I will say, the security dimension, which is intertwined with the civil society. I think that what we have really to do, and that, of course, the work that we have to do, in the EU side and also in France, I'm trying to push that forward, which is to understand that to have those countries, I mean, you, Ukraine, you, Georgia, you, Moldova, on board, is about our own security. And of course, that's also something that you have to say. That's why also I was just mentioning in the beginning that you have to transform the vision of Europe, not only on a zone of economic integration, social progress and trade, but about a zone that is all about security and that share at the same times values and security concerns. And the two are completely intertwined, coming back to the example of Poland. I think that's very visible. You cannot, of course, have on the one hand illiberal values and on the other hand defending the security of Europe against Russia. It's just impossible. And I think it's something that we have really to discuss more openly in the idea to come. And just to conclude, I think that what we are really committed to, and that was very interesting to hear you yesterday, because I think it was really the point that most of the speakers have. You have to give more visibility to the economic agreement, both in the EU, and in Ukraine, Moldova, and Georgia. Actually, I think it doesn't have a great mobility. You have very prominent people, and most of them are here, certainly, who are trying to push the idea on both sides. But if you ask the general public in your countries, if you ask the general public, especially even more, in the EU member states, you ask them about the association agreement, what is it? What is it about? What the tasks? What the purpose? What's the big visions? What are the, the outcomes that we expect? And I think you have to be very clear on that. I'm not saying that's very easy. The second thing is communication. I was already talking about communication. You were talking yesterday about that. You have really to communicate and to make, I think, the progresses visible. To advocate about the public, about the concrete results, and how it contributes to your well-being, to the prosperity, to the economy. I think that's something quite important. And the third thing is, I think that you must not, of course, also show the hopes. And that's a question of EU side. You were mentioning Macron's speech, and I'm talking sometimes with him, a good friend also. Sometimes I disagree also. But I think that the EU head of states and government, including the French president and others, has to give more visibility about the future of Europe, about the borders of Europe. And I think that, Emmanuel Macron especially was talking about the enlargement, which was a good thing. Then there is the French position about, very recently about Moldova. And I was in, no, not about Moldova, about Macedonia, sorry. And I was in Macedonia at that times. And I think that's a very bad signal. And we have to really to be very open to, I would think, to enlargement. Of course, to put very severe conditions, to sell it to the public opinion. But if we cut the move, if we try to slow the process, I think that it will only fuel the arguments of the Eurosceptics and Euro bashers, which will be a very bad thing. So I think let's the hope not be short. That will be my last message. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Nicolas. Indeed, I think that you summarized it quite well about the let's say the way how to bring this idea of integration into EU political agenda. I think that what we need and your reference to issues like rule of law, democracy, and so on, and also, for example, image of the parliament, and I might say that it all requires more attention from both sides, EU and Ukraine, because we so easily rely on these short, sound bites that Ukrainian parliament is corrupted and inefficient, for example. But at the same time, Ukrainian parliament managed to adopt all the necessary laws for visa-free liberalization, managed to adopt all necessary laws for judicial reform, which is more or less supported by the EU and with, let's say, modest but positive assessments for food safety, for some other technical things, for financial reform and so on. So the track record of Ukrainian parliament in this political cycle is extremely efficient, and sometimes even could be compared to the, let's say, most efficient parliaments in our neighboring states during the accession period. So, but at the same time, we have really good soundbite that this parliament is a disaster and this is a really main obstacle for reforms, which is sometimes true for sure, that it is difficult, but if you measure by actual results, it could be quite positive. That's why this attention, this to details, is that something which we really should fight for. And I also would like to agree that this is, so we cannot rely on the EU institutions, especially on EU institutions, because they will be the least ambitious in this dialogue. So it depends on Ukrainian, Georgian, Moldovan push towards the EU and dialogue on political level with politicians, and only then to use technical things, because as we have plenty of technical things and ideas, but they are not working because they are not, let's say, resonate with political discussion. So, dear friends, we have a couple of minutes for your comments or questions. Claudius?
Thank you, Taras. It's probably more a comment than a question, and it relates back, to assessing association as a useful blueprint for reforms, modernization, and everything. And both Adam and Nicolas, you were saying, again, you have to implement it first to show you are diligent and committed, and then to see maybe something happen, in the future regarding further steps. I belong to those who don't think this is a good blueprint for reforms. There are some good things, but mostly good things are beyond agreements and emphasis on rule of law, anti-corruption. These quasi-acquis, not acquis at all. And I would turn the argument. I would say that the association agreement exactly could be implemented only if, it is a good case for it has a good chance and case for implementation only if it is related to future steps of economic integration. Because the benefit is basically, or the EU rules, is about fostering, trade, investment, economic activity, also a bit political capital and everything, but it depends on exchange. Exchange is his value, not so much, it's not a blueprint of running country. It's about increasing, exchange, making it valuable. Therefore, I would turn the argument, I say, next step is necessary to make association work. Thank you.
Thank you, Claudio. Thank you, Claudius.
Good morning. My name is Anne Berzio, German Technical Cooperation, GIZ. First of all, thank you to this exclusively male and senior panel for new thoughts and dynamics on integration. Then I would have a question for Adam. Thank you for pointing out once again this difference of political and legal membership perspective. So if we all agree, especially from the EU side, that the focus should prevail now on implementing the association agreement before thinking further, what do we have to offer? Or can you make some suggestion what can be incentives to keep the momentum, as you called it? And I would be grateful if in your answer you could also reflect a little bit on the Western Balkan discussion, where this issue had been discussed during the last years and where it very easily leads to very technical aspects like a decentralized model for programming of EU-funded goods, or what can be like the carrots. Yeah, thank you.
So, Adam, the question was addressed to you. So, but on the gender element, I might say that this is rather an exemption than a rule, because I moderated a conference this week as well. It was rather imbalanced in different way, but this is one. Again, this is a European panel, so not Ukrainian one.
Right, what am I supposed to say now? Your question, what the EU can offer, what sort of incentives? Well, in the Western Balkans, the first incentive that was offered was, of course, visa-free regime. And now it's the same in the countries of the region. And that's what an ordinary member of the public will understand. I can get to travel with my passport without the need to have a visa. And if they apply for a British visa, then they appreciate even more the Schengen movement. Now, in case of the Balkans, what is on offer is ultimately the membership, and that was made clear in the European Council conclusions. But I think one of the catalysts in the Western Balkans has been the accession of Croatia. As sort of evidence, one of us made it, so we can all make it if we roll up our sleeves and do the reforms which are required. But it is also true that because it takes so much time, and EU is mushrooming the conditionality and the benchmarks for good or bad reasons, that we're losing the momentum. And we've lost it in former Yugoslav Republic of Macedonia long time ago. We were losing it in Albania as well. And now that's one of the reasons why the Commission decided to persuade the member states to do this pre-screening exercise to keep wheels moving, so that those countries actually have functioning interinstitutional structures and do their own pre-screening and get the first sort of direct experience with what accession negotiations are. And that's not exactly a walk in the park, because very often, especially political circles, perceive accession as a political exercise, which it is, but it's also an extremely tedious technical exercise in itself. Now, what can EU offer to Ukraine? Well, that's the problem, because if you don't have an official political statement, yes, one day you can join, it may be difficult for the Ukrainian authorities or for the Georgian authorities actually to persuade the public that this is something good for them, especially the business community, which is torn apart between exporting products to Russia, where different standards need to be met, and products to EU, where we have completely different standards. But that is also a lot about communication, which was mentioned by Nikolai. The communication and education here is absolutely essential, because there are benefits, as Claudius has also said, in the association agreement, and there are benefits that people can tangibly touch or benefit from If you implement environmental legislation, yes, it is expensive, but potentially the air will be cleaner, and so on and so forth. But we're talking about Ukraine. Now, as Nicolas was speaking, I was thinking about signing association agreement in the United Kingdom, still a member state. And it immediately brought me to the referendum, where a large portion of voters had absolutely no clue what the EU is. The keyword searched mostly on Google the day after the referendum was, what's the EU? So if people don't have a clue about the European Union, how we can introduce into something more sophisticated as association agreement with a country which is really, really far away from, for instance, Ireland or United Kingdom. And we had an exercise with all of this in the Netherlands with the referendum, of course. Now, if I may, since I was given the microphone, I'll abuse my dominant position. Just very briefly on what Taras made, sort of said about my little spiel and the Brexit agreement in its level of detail. Now, please don't forget that Brexit agreement is not integration agreement, it's de-integration agreement. And that explains why there's so much level of detail. Because we're moving from internal market, we're stepping into unknown. The part which shocked me when it comes to level of detail is free movement of persons. That section is way more detailed than our EU legislation on movement of people. That has to do with the first factor that I mentioned, de-integration, and the second, which is complete lack of trust in the United Kingdom, and in particular in Home Office, and the way, for instance, applications for permanent residence of EU citizens have been processed. So I wouldn't draw too many conclusions from the Brexit agreement for Ukraine, to be honest. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. We have, I think, the chance for another one comment. Yeah, please.
Thank you. My name is Tamar Kholodawa. I come from Parliament of Georgia. It's great to be here, and I'm sorry I missed part of this panel, so my question comes mostly from the ideas that I picked up after I joined you. We are discussing integration without membership, and this idea became debated because we see that there is no appetite in the EU for enlargement right now in this part of the world which interests us, Georgia, Ukraine, Moldova. Is there a different situation? Do you see a different political position within the EU and the EU member states with regard to these other established models of integration without membership? Is there better appetite for, let's say, like EFTA agreement with these countries than the EU membership? Do you see any difference there? Would this be politically something that would be more acceptable for EU member states? Because we've heard you speak a lot about different preconditions, that there has to be a bulletproof kind of argument that association agreement is implemented, commitment to values, parliaments that are, great, and all that, economy, trade. But what about the other side, the readiness and preparedness of EU? Thank you.
So, I think that this is a question a proper question for conclusions of all of you after listening to each other. So
maybe very, very briefly. First of all, I just want to say about the question of taking back control. Taking back control for the UK would be certainly to stop Brexit. I think it will be obviously the best way to take back control. But having said that, when it comes also to both to the EU and to Ukraine, Georgia, and Moldova, I think if they want to be, I will say, on control in a way, they have certainly to understand what's behind the EU memberships, or I will say very deep association, which is first of all to counter the narrative of our enemies, which is just to break down, I think, what the EU is about. And I remember I was traveling extensively to the Balkans states during a long period of time, since about 2005, to Serbia, Montenegro, Croatia, etc., Bosnia. And I think that especially in Serbia, where the political stage is very divided, to be a member of the EU and to move towards accessions and to have the benefits of the accessions, but also the constraints of the accessions, was certainly the best way to deter the propaganda of the anti-EU. And I think that's very clear also. Ukraine, I think there is no doubt, because you don't have many people, of course, standing with Russia. But in Moldova, you know that the political stage is divided. Not talking about your president. I speak very bluntly, as I say. Huh? I have to say it. And Georgia, I was discussing with a Georgian friend yesterday. Still you have 25%, from what I heard, of the Georgian populations looking east and not looking west. Okay, but still, you still have a minority. It's a minority, even if Georgia, is occupied. 20% of the territory is occupied by Russia. You still have people advocating in these directions, and I think that the EU has really, first of all, to call a spade a spade. I mean, when you have an aggressions, and I think that's. I think also the government, the president, the head of states, the head of the government, had really to be clear and to expose, to disclose publicly the Russia's propaganda, and then to advocate about the EU and to advocate about the enlargement. I think, when you are talking, I think when you are talking about the progress in my view, the progresses of the EU, and about the question is memberships, it's not only, I will say, about economic prosperity. It's also taking back control of the situation in a very conflictual period for the European continent right now. For me, that's the real purpose of the EU. Of course, that's economic integration, progresses of the rule of law, and everything that I mentioned that absolutely needed. As a human rights activist, I must say that, of course, the question of the compliance with the rule of law and the independence of the judiciary, the freedom of the media, that's not negotiable. That cannot be negotiable. But we have to understand the geopolitical consequences of that. Sorry to be...
Absolutely okay. So then Michael and Christoph, maybe you will answer the same question as a conclusion for our debate.
Thank you. I'd just like to pick up, first of all, on the Brexit question, which is a subject of ongoing pain and agony for most of us who have British passports. But just leaving aside that, what have we been observing there? It's an interesting experiment, painful as it were, but a very interesting experiment, a search process for integration without membership. The Prime Minister started off saying, there is no model that is a good model for us. We are who we are, we are unique, and we will make a good deal with the European Union. That speech turned out to be totally empty and without foundation. We, and let's conclude, both Adam and myself, have been writing for some time that, well, given the intrinsic interests of the European Union while leaving, actually what they should probably go for is something looking rather like the Ukraine model. Now, the Prime Minister can just about pronounce the words Canada and Norway, but she can't pronounce the word Ukraine. Well, that's her problem. But she has got to the point recently of saying, the slide of language, we want a deep and special relationship for a while, and now, more recently, she said she wants a deep and comprehensive free trade area. Yeah, so this is all very interesting because it shows that the Darwinian process of trying various ideas that don't survive, but converging on ideas that do survive, this Darwinian process has been revealing itself. And so you're onto something, which is not that stupid. Right? But then there's the question from over there, your question, your overarching question, as to whether there's any good model for integration without membership. Well, the EEA actually appears to be stable, and so it's a model. It exists. The Swiss special deal also is, well, under tension, but it exists and it's more or less stable, so it's not impossible. However, the question is whether that model is good for the association agreement countries. And there one must have doubts, because you understand that this whole business is one of trying to lock into not just European phytosanitary regulations, but also European profound societal, political values of democracy, freedom, and so forth, from which. And so that is part of the package that you need to consolidate the technical processes and in order to get closer to your fundamental objectives. If you take Norway and Switzerland, they are such perfect heavenly democracies with such perfect respect for human rights. They don't seem to need any engagement with the European Union for that purpose. So they're in a special category which is not really the relevant one. So I would really come back to the basic position that you could head into the EA, but not as a permanent steady state solution, but as a transit camp towards full membership, which will be more in conformity with your fundamental needs and objectives.
I'm not really sure what I should add to what Michael said. My short answer is I'm not really sure, but the question also is kind of what does Ukraine want? And I think in this sense, kind of the European Union accession process kind of stands out, you know, as kind of probably the most successful reform tool that has ever been developed, right? And so after membership, you know, I think it's really something very, very different. And I think in this sense, it makes a lot of sense to basically try to keep this. And I don't know if it necessarily has to end in membership, but I think this process as such always is extremely helpful. But maybe to say something on the earlier question on what can the European Union offer, I think we tend to overestimate the influence of the European Union. You know, it's essentially, I think when what the European Union can do, it can help. It can be basically a coach in this process. I think we cannot kind of, you know, it's difficult to force people to do or something that they don't want to do. They're not convinced it's good doing. And with states, I think it's very similar, right? But if there is a country where there is enough, how to say, momentum among society, political leadership in the administration, then the European Union, I think, can play an extraordinary role. And this is kind of, yeah, it's like a tennis coach, you know? The coach doesn't play necessarily better than Federer, you know? But Federer, one of the greatest players, he still needs a coach, you know, to basically get better. And this role, I think, the European Union has, in the recent years, not really played very well. When you look at, essentially, it's about feedback. It's about creative, honest feedback. And we are failing also in the Western Balkans, which are supposedly more on this process. We have two countries which are even negotiating. But when it gets to what do we really tell them? You have these annual reports, which are extremely difficult to read, which even if you make the effort, you know, you pick any chapter you want and then read the report of the previous year and try to understand where has the country been going. Read the report of a neighboring country and try to figure out, you know, which country is now more advanced. It's actually, you are at a loss. It's because it's so unsystematic, because there the delegation writes about these two topics on statistics. In Albania, it writes about 3 other topics. Here it highlights this problem, and in Bosnia, yet another one. And the overall picture of where do the countries really stand, we are very, very weak on communicating this. And so kind of, I think it would be very helpful if countries, Ukraine, Georgia, Moldova, demand this, you know, say, we want, because this is a bit of an effort, and the European Union has kind of, you know, been cutting back. There are much less people of the linkages involved in assessing. You have a lot of the work is now done in the delegations in Podgorica, in Belgrade, and the skills are not there partially, and there are not enough people doing this. So this is an effort, but I think it's very worth calling for this effort. It's crucial in order to push further for reforms, and I think there's a second reason which is also very important, and this is it actually allows you to show that you have made progress once you have made progress. When you look at the visa liberalization process, France was very much opposed to give Albania visa-free travel for all sorts of reasons. And I'm convinced that Albania would not have gotten it if there would not have been very clear evidence that actually the Albanians have done as well as the Bosnians and as the Montenegrins. Because this made it very, of course France could have vetoed, but it would have been so obvious that it was blatantly against kind of what the assessment said. But if we would not have had this assessment, this would have left so much leeway of saying, oh, you know, and the Albanians still, yeah. So I think it will be also very crucial in order to help convince skeptics inside the European Union of the countries moving closer to the European Union. Thank you.
Thank you. I think that this session was useful for me personally, because when I use the same rhetoric as all of you are using in dialogue with EU officials, sometimes they try to convince me that I am an idiot, and I believe that your speeches prove that I am not. And I honestly believe that there are a lot of ideas and instruments and mechanics which can be used as incentives while we have no membership perspectives, and there are plenty of them and different examples, as you heard. I also thank you for confirming that that the EU will not lead this, and especially EU institutions, because I thought this is something personal from my side to criticize EU institutions and support group for Ukraine, especially for non-taking this leadership in discussion about integrations. Yeah, for technical support, yes, for some monitoring, yes, but not talking about what is next, not talking about this kind of incentives. I think that this is clear that EU institutions will not lead this process. It is for Ukraine, Moldova, Georgia, and them together to push for something. And we are trying to do this. And what is my conclusion as well is that, first of all, we cannot be too technical, because if you go with a rational proposal saying, here we can use EEA model or Swiss model, or we have some, let's say, proto-EEA in association agreement that is something similar to it, it doesn't work, because people who work with Ukraine in European institutions, they afraid of any ambition. So if you show this idea to EU official which works with some other issue, they say, okay, it works. It works with Norway, why it cannot work with Ukraine? But if you show the same idea to person who works with Ukraine, the person say, any person will say that, no, it is impossible. It is impossible, because Norway is Norway, Ukraine is Ukraine. So that's also shows the attitude of a European institution towards us. That's why it's on us to push, not to be technical, to go for political things, and not talk only about technical features like food safety or something else, because rule of law is essential, but not only in terms of big topics, but also details, because it was interesting when I heard a part of debate in Polish parliament about judicial reform, and MPs from opposition saying you are doing quite opposite to what Ukraine is doing now in judicial reform. And for me it was really like a pleasure to hear that in Polish parliament Ukraine is shown as an example for judicial reform. Yes, so that's also sounds strange, but sometimes it happens as well. So it means that we are on good track. And after all, I think that what we need to understand is that also an experience that all that we are talking about is a long-term process. And unfortunately, before the entry into force of association agreement, it was totally impossible to talk about any further integration, or any model of integration even within association agreement, because the agreement was in the making, and there were a lot of skeptics about whether it will enter into force or not. Now it's only 1 year of application, and we should bear in mind that even for EEA idea, it took 5 or 6 years of high-level political dialogue in 80s to create common vision about how it can work. So that's why every no from the EU should not be treated as a final no. Sometimes I think that we will elaborate a good formula which will be based on experience which was presented by our speakers. Despite all the gender imbalances, I think the ideas here presented were good, nice, and interesting for all of you. So thank you for your attention, thank you for your speeches, and let's enjoy coffee. Thank you.